They paid thousands to rent real mummies, and one guest got killed. During the Victorian era in England, there was a hobby no one was supposed to know about. Let me explain. The year is 1886. You are an up-and-coming archaeologist with a new discovery that will make you famous. Well, at least it could if the higher-ups don't find out, because your dig site is giving up a few relics. But you have found something very big, and so far nobody knows. This isn't some pulp adventure novel. This really happened when archaeologists found King Tutankhamun's tomb. But instead of Howard Carter, it was a team of excavators, led by two men named Flinders Petrie and William Flinders Petrie. Their find attracted worldwide attention, and a lot of British aristocrats had questions, like what's inside a tomb? How do you open it, and why does it smell like cat food? Okay, maybe that last one was just me. But still, everyone wanted a piece of the action. So the two archaeologists hosted a private viewing. They placed the treasures on display and invited a small group of friends and family to gawk and ask questions. And while this might sound like the first episode of an Indiana Jones spin-off, this modest gathering was the start of a craze. Over the next 2 decades, it became fashionable for the elite to host similar viewing parties called mummy parties. But hold on, these sounds horrible. Were people literally throwing mummy-themed costume parties? Not exactly. Instead, hosts would bring out ancient artifacts and attempt to recreate the experience of discovering them. Perhaps someone would narrate how they braved dangerous climates, wild animals, and booby traps to get there. Then they'd lift the cloth covering the artifact, which would be dramatically lit with gaslight, candlelight, or even a spotlight. Think of it like a magic trick, except instead of pulling a rabbit out of a hat, they're pulling an ibis out of a sarcophagus. It's unclear who came up with this format, but historians believe it might have started with the unboxing of Rosetta Stone in 1802. After all, the slab of basalt with inscribed hieroglyphics was discovered inside a broken sarcophagus lid. So it makes sense that the trend would start with Napoleon's army stealing it from Egypt and bringing it to London. Regardless of the origin, it quickly caught on. After the first successful mummy party, word spread through society channels, and soon everyone was doing it. Here are the 3 wildest mummy parties that shocked Victorian England. 1. The first private aristocratic unveiling, hosted by Thomas Pettigrew. This exclusive show featured real artifacts in a candlelit drawing room to the rented mummy scandal in Yorkshire. A wealthy couple reportedly paid hundreds of pounds to rent an actual mummy for their spectacle. 3. The Royal Windsor Castle Gala. Queen Victoria herself hosted a public mummy reveal performance on castle grounds. People would hire actors to play the parts of bumbling explorers, and hired servants to pose as natives fleeing their torches. Some hosts would even dress up themselves. Can you imagine your uncle showing up to Thanksgiving wearing a loincloth? Yeah, that was a thing back then. It was also common for hosts to bid against each other, trying to outdo one another's spectacle with bigger sets, more exotic locations, or perhaps even real mummies. Wait, what? That's right. At the height of the trend, people were renting human mummies for their parties, paying anywhere from 5 to 50 guineas, the equivalent of several $1,000s today. Now, we don't know how many mummies were dug up for this purpose, but it certainly didn't help the reputation of grave robbers. Although at this point, most of the bodies had already been sold off to museums and private collectors. Still, that didn't stop some unscrupulous hosts from seeking out fresh specimens. For example, in 1887, a wealthy couple in Yorkshire spent £100, again, thousands of dollars, to rent a body. But after locals heard about their plans, they threatened to call the police unless they donated it to a medical school. Eventually, the couple relented. So while this particular mummy party never happened, this incident is proof that people would go to great lengths to get a good show. After all, what kind of party would be complete without a mummified corpse? Of course, in order to rent such a thing, you'd need an income to rival a small country. But strangely enough, this was one of the few cases where mummy parties were affordable. That's because the trend didn't just affect the aristocracy. Some shows cost as little as 25 shillings, or about $100, but that didn't mean the experience was any less intense. Even middle-class partygoers would arrive in costume, eager to see what relic would be revealed next. Imagine being 10 years old and watching the servant slowly drape black cloth over the table, occasionally glancing at the flickering gaslights beneath. Then, with a dramatic flourish, he lifts the cloth to reveal a dusty old urn. As the crowd cheers, you strain to hear the host's description of the lost civilization that created such fine craftsmanship. Now, it's likely that this party wasn't exactly authentic. In fact, most of the objects used in mummy parties were fakes. As the demand for artifacts grew, so did the market for replicas. Most were made by a single company run by a former hatter named John Henry Pepper. Pepper produced entire sets, including wall panels carved with hieroglyphics, painted statues, and fake sarcophagi. His biggest customers were the upper crust, who bought his cheaper kits to add to their collections. But he also produced high-end lines for wealthy tourists visiting London. Of course, this left a bad taste in the mouths of those who knew about it. But surprisingly, they were a minority. For the average person, the authenticity didn't matter. The thrill was in the presentation, not the provenance. Unfortunately, this fanned the flames of controversy because many of these artifacts were stolen from Egyptian tombs. There were also rumors that party hosts paid grave robbers directly. But regardless of the source, there was no denying that the excitement was genuine. In fact, it was so intense that one critic compared it to pornography. But don't worry, I'm not going to read that whole passage. Just know that the author believed both activities provided cheap thrills to the masses. Yet, as the craze grew, the crowds got larger and more rowdy. At one party, the audience cheered when a woman holding a skull fell backwards into a chair. Another time, someone pulled an unwrapped mummy from a coffin and paraded it through the streets. It became a common sight in London and Paris, so it's easy to see why the trend eventually died out, but the end came much sooner than expected. 1897, an 18-year-old woman named Evelyn Ellis attended a party with her mother. The host unveiled an ornate sarcophagus, and as the crowd leaned in, it suddenly tipped over. The heavy lid struck Evelyn on the head, killing her instantly. Her death sparked outrage among the public. And finally, the government stepped in, passing laws that made it illegal to rent mummies and to handle human remains for entertainment. Overnight, the fad evaporated. John Henry Pepper closed shop and the remaining mummies went back to the grave. Wait, what about the title? Did these parties really happen in the homes of the elite, technically? No. See, the reality is that the biggest, best-known shows were actually given in purpose-built theaters. However, there was one notable exception. That's because 2 years before the accident, a royal mummy party was held in Windsor Castle. It was hosted by Queen Victoria herself, who dressed as an Egyptian queen and conversed with actors playing biblical characters. Although she wasn't aware of it, this would be the last mummy party ever. But what did she think of it? According to court records, she enjoyed the spectacle immensely, and I don't blame her. Would you pass up the chance to star in your own low-budget period drama? Well, if you want to attend a mummy party yourself, too bad. You can't. As we mentioned, the fad died out shortly after the turn of the century. However, the desire to unearth the past never faded. And luckily, there's a better way to get your fix without robbing graves. For example, you can watch our videos, which are full of artifacts and archaeology. Or you could visit a museum, which has a surprisingly large collection of ancient Egyptian artifacts. Just look at this gallery of funerary masks. Aren't they beautiful? Well, I thought they were, until I realized what they were actually depicting. Turns out the faces are meant to scare away evil spirits, so I guess they're working pretty well. When I lived in Paris, I spent my free time exploring its catacombs. That's the underground tunneling maze, where over 6 million people died during the French Revolution. And while I was there, I kept thinking, how did this become a tourist hotspot? Because when I visited, I was just one of dozens of people wandering around taking pictures. In fact, when I tried to sneak into a forbidden section, I found an entire school field trip with chaperones taking notes. It made me wonder, how does a place meant for grieving turn into a place for Instagram posts? Well, after reporting on this story, I realized there's a universal truth about human nature. No matter how much we try to deny it, humans love nothing more than staring at death. Before we built social media, Parisians didn't have Netflix or TikTok. So when something shocking happened, they would flock to the scene. And in 1833, the whole city went crazy over a dead girl named Marie. She was an 11-year-old who fell off her roof while washing clothes. And when emergency workers arrived, they found she had only a small gash above her left eye. At first they thought maybe her father had hurt her, but he swore he hadn't. Maybe it was an animal, he suggested, but the police weren't convinced. See, Marie was already known to them. Just a few weeks earlier, she'd gotten into a massive fight with her mom. Marie ran away from home and hasn't been seen since. And now here she was, dead from a fall, but with no witnesses. With no way to prove foul play, the police couldn't move her body until her family claimed it. But Marie was known to be an orphan. Her mother had abandoned her years ago, and her father was too poor to pay for a proper funeral. So instead, they put her body in the city morgue, a building where Paris stored unidentified corpses. But the morgue was also a place to find your missing relatives, so people flocked there to search for loved ones. At first, this was a rare occurrence. But in 1827, France passed a law allowing the public to visit the morgue once a week. Maybe it was to encourage people to identify missing persons, or maybe it was because Parisians loved nothing more than morbid curiosity. Either way, officials expected a few dozen visitors each week. But instead, thousands showed up, pushing and shoving to get inside. And by the next year, Parisians were lining up for hours to enter the morgue every single day, won the shocking daily crowds. Up to 40,000 visitors, queuing just to peer through the glass display windows to the stunning display method. Bodies drained, iced or frozen, dressed and shown on angled marble slabs behind plate glass. 3. The Enfant de la Rue du Vert Boys case. In 1886, the display of a child's body drew over 150,000 people, stopping traffic. Now you might think this was because of the smell, like the stereotypical rotting flesh and all that. But actually it was the total opposite. See, the Paris Morgue was designed so that nobody could smell anything. Each room had incredible ventilation and the floors were tilted so liquids would drain. They even piped in fresh flowers to mask any lingering odors. So what exactly was everyone looking at? Well, in the 1830s, most morgues displayed bodies behind glass, just like an insect display at a museum. But the Paris Morgue went a step further. Every corpse was accompanied by a placard displaying their supposed cause of death. So while Marie's body was unidentified, her placard read "Poor Child," which only fueled rumors that her father had killed her. People began writing novels and plays based on her sad story. Our artists made paintings and sculptures of her lying in state. One guy even wrote a song about her, and it became such a hit that other composers started ripping it off. By the end of 1833, Marie had become the morbid Mona Lisa of Paris. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the craze ended. After 3 months, her body was buried in a mass grave, along with dozens of others whose families never claimed. But even after Marie was gone, Parisians continued to pack the morgue. Not because they wanted to identify a loved one, but simply because they loved death. In fact, I found records of a man who visited the morgue 400 times in 1 year, and a woman who cut off a chunk of someone's hair as a souvenir. Even politicians got involved, trying to capitalize on the trend by holding fancy balls at the morgue after dark. And in 1837, the city opened a new wing onto the morgue, complete with velvet ropes and uniformed guards, because clearly what this needed was more spectacle. And while this sounds completely insane today, it was part of a larger shift in how people viewed death, beginning with a teenager named Restophe de la Bretonne. He was born in the 18th century, and his writings capture a time when people saw death as a natural part of life. He wrote about how attending an execution was like going to a concert, or how the streets of Paris were filled with so many dead animals and people that you just learned to ignore them. Basically, if you want to understand the Paris Morgue craze, you need to understand the mindset of the 1800s. Because back then, it wasn't unusual to see dead bodies in public. The thing is, our current fear of death is mostly a modern invention. For centuries, people just kind of accepted it as part of daily life. Yes, death was sad, but it was inevitable, so the best thing you could do was make peace with it. And one way they did that was by making death a bit more fun. In medieval times, for example, they held festivals where people dressed as skeletons danced in the streets. And in Victorian England, they held resurrection men parties where guests would bring body snatchers to reanimate recently deceased people. Of course, the body snatchers always claimed the guest had chosen the wrong person. Then they'd bring the corpse to life by slapping, poking, and tickling them, at which point the partygoers would run around screaming. So basically, people have been turning death into entertainment ever since we understood it was inevitable. But nowhere was this more true than in Paris. See, up until the 1800s, the city was legally abolishing public executions, meaning fewer opportunities for public displays of death. But then, in 1831, King Charles X was overthrown in a revolution and replaced by Louis Philippe. The new king encouraged public events again, but with one important difference: these wouldn't be executions, they'd be festivals. Suddenly, there were public balls in the streets, military parades, and artistic performances. It was like Paris was trying to make up for lost time. And while none of these events involved death, they did share one thing in common: crowds. You see, Parisians had a reputation for being the most unruly in Europe, throwing riots over cabbage and staging revolutions over bread. In fact, the new king's entire rise to power depended on how pissed Parisians were about the price of bread. So naturally, he hoped that by hosting public events he could distract them, and so far it was working. But then came the June Rebellion, an entire week of fighting between citizens and soldiers that left hundreds dead. The king hoped that the morgue would be a new distraction, something exciting enough to take people's minds off the rebellion. And unlike a ball or a parade, the morgue was free. As the crowds grew, the government capitalized on the trend by making the morgue more spectacular. For example, they added music to the experience. There was a guard stationed outside the entrance to play a jaunty tune, while another sat inside to announce the number of bodies on display. This morbid game of telephone spread quickly through the crowd, whipping people up into a frenzy. In fact, one report said that people sometimes fainted due to the sheer excitement. Others say the guards often couldn't keep order as people pushed to get closer to the corpses. Some even claim that people would rip chunks out of the dead to take home as souvenirs. Of course, it didn't last forever. As the century wore on, science advanced, technology improved, and medicine developed. Soon, the days of publicly executed criminals and mass graves were over. And by the end of the 19th century, death wasn't private anymore. It was public performance. So how can we prevent this from happening today? Well, despite what you may think, we're actually in a really good position. See, it wasn't until the 1800s that people stopped viewing death as normal. Before that, it was just part of daily life. And today, we've swung back the other way. Death is still taboo, shameful, something we try to hide. But that doesn't mean we're doing a better job dealing with it. If anything, it means we've traded spectacle for stigma, public executions for private funerals. But by refusing to show death in public, we don't learn how to deal with it. We don't normalize it. That's why it scares us so much. Have you ever gotten takeout food and then stayed in bed all day while watching TV? Some people take that concept to a whole other level and do the same thing. Except instead of Netflix, they binge war. For centuries, some of the most bloodthirsty spectacles have also been America's favorite pastime. And nowhere was that more true than during the U.S. Civil War. When the first major conflict of the war broke out in July of 1861, many Americans flocked to see it as if it were the hottest new baseball stadium. People packed up their lunches, loaded up their carriages, and headed straight for the closest bloodshed. And that first major fight soon became infamous for just how many of those kinds of spectators it attracted. The result was an event that's become known as the Great Skedaddle. But to understand why so many Americans wanted to attend a war zone, we have to first talk about how naivete, nationalism, and morbid curiosity can lead to disaster when combined with a free afternoon. So I'm here to tell you about one of the bloodiest times in American history. There are a lot of reasons why so many people went to watch the Civil War. Some of them are obvious. Back before ESPN, radio, or the internet, there weren't many ways to learn what was happening in the outside world. And those who lived near the front lines might have seen the conflict as a way to escape the monotony of daily life. Plus, there was also a bit of morbid curiosity at play, a desire to see what the actual hell was going on. But it wasn't just Southern sympathizers flocking to the fields of battle. Many Northerners also attended the war with the same sense of adventure you might bring to a football game or a concert. In fact, one Virginian even reported seeing people at the battle with flags reading "Go Army Go." And others were simply curious about how this newfangled thing called war worked. After all, it had been more than a half-century since the nation's founding, and many of its citizens had never witnessed armed conflict firsthand. Of course, there was also a great deal of patriotism involved. Nowhere was that more evident than at the first major battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run, also known as the First Battle of Manassas. On July 21, 1861, the newly formed Union Army camped along Bull Run, which today we call the Battle of Manassas. Their Confederate opponents, meanwhile, were stationed nearby in a small town called Manassas, Virginia. When rumors started circulating that the Union forces were planning to attack, Confederate generals decided to strike first. At around 6 a.m., Confederate troops left their camp and marched toward the Union's Henry House Hill, named after the family that once owned the property and not the U.S. general. As the two armies faced off on opposite sides of the hill, neither side could gain an advantage. So the fighting eventually spread across several miles of dense forest. That's when word of the battle reached Washington, D.C., just 30 miles away, and people began heading to the front lines with picnic baskets in hand. It was a beautiful summer day, and Washingtonians eager to experience the conflict firsthand piled into carriages, hopped on trains, or even walked the entire way. Among them were President Abraham Lincoln and his son Robert Todd Lincoln, along with tens of thousands of others. It was like going to a 4th of July celebration, recalled one participant. Everyone was in good humor, and it seemed as though nothing could go wrong. And for the first few hours, it looked like they'd be right. In the early stages of the battle, the Union appeared to be gaining the upper hand. And at around 1 p.m., it looked as if they might be able to claim a quick victory over the Confederates. But at that moment, Confederate General Thomas J. Jackson's brigade arrived on the battlefield and formed a strong defensive position on a ridge at the base of Henry House Hill. They came to be known as Jackson's Foot by the soldiers fighting against them. Thanks to their steadfast refusal to move despite heavy fire, from their perspective, that meant they now had a good chance of winning. But it also meant that the Union troops were in for a brutal surprise. With a renewed sense of confidence, Confederate General Pierre G.T. Beauregard ordered another assault, and this time they broke through the Union's defenses. That's when the crowds watching from afar noticed something strange. Amidst the smoke and shouting, they saw large groups of Union soldiers retreating in haste. To those watching, it almost looked like a coordinated maneuver, but in reality, it was a full-blown rout. Thousands of Union troops dropped their weapons and ran for the hills. Even the president's son, Robert, considered fleeing. He was only persuaded to stay by an aide who reminded him his father was counting on him to relay information about the battle back to the White House. So Robert took a seat on an overturned water tank and watched as the situation grew increasingly dire. Confederate soldiers quickly overwhelmed the Union's defenses and moved in for the kill. Meanwhile, the spectators watching from the sidelines grew nervous. Although they hadn't come to the battle expecting anything more than a Union victory, they now realized they might have gotten themselves into something dangerous. Still, some were reluctant to leave. Former President John Tyler declared he wasn't leaving not for 1,000 dangers. But as the crowd grew increasingly restless, the decision was made to evacuate. Tens of thousands of people began running away from the battlefield. At least they thought they were running away from the battlefield. The problem was that, as they fled, they accidentally joined the fight. Those watching the battle from the sidelines were mostly civilians, men, women, and children who hadn't expected to get much closer than the hills overlooking the battlefield. But as the tide of the war turned and they decided to leave, they inadvertently entered the fight. That's because while they were making their way to the safety of the hills, they ended up marching right into the middle of the Confederate line of retreat. To make matters worse, these non-combatants were dressed in civilian clothes, meaning that when Confederate soldiers opened fire, they had no way of knowing who to shoot. In the end, nobody knew where to go or what to do. One man described the scene as a gigantic game of leapfrog, except instead of merely hopping over each other's backs, people were falling flat on their faces, often directly into the path of oncoming cannons. Women and children got separated from their parties and chased by angry soldiers. There were even reports of people getting trampled by stampeding cattle. As the sun began to set, people were still trying to escape, but the delay had cost them dearly. While the final death toll remains unknown, it's estimated that dozens of civilians lost their lives that day, many of them killed by friendly fire. Others didn't even realize they'd been shot until after they'd escaped the battlefield. Eventually, the majority of those watching the battle made it back to Washington, D.C., shaken but unharmed. However, among the dead and wounded were former President John Tyler's son, Confederate Lieutenant Harrison Ruffin, Tyler, and Marshall, enslaved man who belonged to Virginia Governor Henry Wise. Though news of the defeat caused a stir in the capital, it quickly faded from memory. But the incident has since gone down in history as one of the deadliest blunders in American leisure history, and it's become known as the Great Skedaddle. So let this be a lesson to us all. If an event sounds like fun but also involves war, it probably isn't. This is mob football. If football allowed riots, fistfights, and broken jaws, it would look like this. Every year, two teams battle for over 20 miles through English towns, smashing windows, breaking bones, and stopping at nothing to get the ball across the line. It's an organized free-for-all where anything goes except one rule: don't die. If football allowed riots, fistfights, and broken jaws, it would look like this. Every year, two teams battle for over 20 miles through English towns, smashing windows, breaking bones, and stopping at nothing to get the ball across the line. It's an organized free-for-all where anything goes except one rule: don't die. Every year on Shrove Tuesday, hundreds of men leave their jobs, their families, and all sense of personal safety to play the oldest, wildest, and most violent game in history. And when I say that, I don't mean it used to be crazy, but now it's tame. I mean, it's still absolutely insane. I watched them play, and then I dug through the history books to find out how people have been playing mob football for over 800 years, what it really is, and how it survived being banned by kings. In 1100 years, people have changed a lot. Kings have changed a lot, but mob football has stayed exactly the same. There's only one rule, and it's simple: survive. Anything goes. You can punch, kick, tackle, bite, cheat, or even murder your way towards the end zone. But if you get killed, your team loses. So there is a reason to keep your head screwed on at least. As long as you can keep your eyes on the ball, you could be forgiven for thinking you'd stepped onto the set of a historical movie. But trust me, this isn't Hollywood. These guys aren't actors. They're regular people who grew up playing normal sports until they learned about mob football. These days, everyone knows violence is bad, right? Well, not these guys. For weeks beforehand, people train hard, eat well, and prepare for battle, because this is no joke. It's a full-on assault course through some of England's busiest towns, and the competition is fierce. It takes grit, determination, and the stomach for some serious pain. I asked some of the players what had brought them to this crazy sport. For some of them, it was a dare. For others, a chance to break away from the humdrum of modern life. But for most, it was about belonging. The first recorded game was in 1176, making it over 800 years old. Back then, it was called folk football, and it was played all over England. It had no real structure, just two teams trying to push a ball through checkpoints controlled by rival villages. Over the centuries, it got more intense. In 1583, King Henry VIII complained that, quote, "the people did use such unseemly games on Shrove Tuesday, as commonly there were divers broken heads and bloody noses. It's no surprise he banned it." After all, during the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell actually ordered the sport to be cancelled, so that the men could focus on, not getting murdered. So if the royals hate it, the commoners love it. It became a game of two halves, literally. The first half was played by whoever woke up first, usually with both teams sleeping together in the same houses. You can imagine how raucous those nights were. Then the second half began with a church service, because obviously. After it was game on, townspeople split into two sides and ran through the streets with the ball, dodging shops, trees, rivers, pubs, cows, literally anything that got in their way. All the local men would play, regardless of age, skill, or even sobriety, and there were no referees. I mean, what are you going to do? Yellow card someone. It didn't matter if you broke an arm or cracked a skull, it was every man for himself. The only rule was, don't get killed. As the game went on, people started betting on it. Local butchers put money down on their favorite players. Shopkeepers bet on which window would get smashed first. Farmers sent their wives in to collect money from houses as the crowd passed by. By the end of the game, the players could earn enough to buy new boots, a whole pig, or even an entire cow. If you were lucky enough to score the winning try, you'd become a local hero. But this madcap game had its downsides. Shops were regularly smashed, animals gored, and several people died. Between 1840 and 1900 alone, there were 13 recorded deaths, including a 14-year-old boy crushed to death by the crowd. The town was often left in ruins, too. Houses had their roofs trodden on, fences had their gates kicked down, and the constant fighting meant nobody was safe. It was uncommon for people to wander into the middle of the street, just as a wave of shirtless men charged past carrying a giant ball. You couldn't even hide in your own home because if you opened the door, you could get seriously hurt. Eventually, in 1850, the government threatened to crack down on the towns unless they stopped playing mob football.
That's right.
The mob had gotten so out of hand that the authorities were forced to intervene. They told the people they could either stop playing football or they descend in the army and ban it by force. To make matters worse, the local church wanted the Shrove Tuesday holiday to be spent praying, not playing deadly sports. Eventually, most towns agreed to stop playing, but a few kept it going in secret. Today, we're bringing it back. Now, you might be wondering how this barbaric sport has survived for over 800 years, and the answer is pretty simple. People love it. Small towns where it's still played today have made it into a festival, complete with parades, parties, and plenty of beer. Teams from all over England travel for miles to take part, knowing that they're in for a wild ride. One of the biggest games is in the town of Atherstone. The Atherstone ball game is the oldest sporting event in the world, dating all the way back to 1325. Every year on Shrove Tuesday, they lock up their shops, shut off the roads, and let the mob go wild. This isn't for the faint-hearted. Even the players agree to a strict code of conduct before kicking off. To play, you have to be over 16 years old and sign a waiver saying that you won't and sue anyone if you break your neck. Players also have to wear protective clothing, helmets, and mouthguards. There's even a medic on standby to treat any injuries. Despite this, people still get badly hurt. Last year, a player fractured his skull and had to be taken to the hospital. Another tore his hamstring clean off. Several people need stitches, but they always come back for more. Some see it as a test of endurance. Others love the chance to show off in front of their friends. For many, it's about being part of a team, even if that team is just a bunch of shirtless strangers. But whatever the reason, the atmosphere is electric. Shouts echo around the narrow streets as the players weave through the crowd. Cheers turn to screams as someone gets tackled. Then they pop back up, dust themselves off, and carry on running. All around the pitch, people watch from the sidelines, taking bets, slapping backs, and enjoying the spectacle. When I was there, I saw grown men in suits and ties screaming and jumping around like they were at a football World Cup, of course. I couldn't resist the chance to play myself, and I'm happy to report that I didn't die. But maybe that's just because I didn't actually play. I was just standing on the side filming. Maybe next time. If you want to see what mob football looks like, here's a little recap. If you want to play yourself, why not join them next year, on Shrove Tuesday, February 2025. Just make sure you bring a helmet and a whole lot of courage. Once a year, a small town in England relives its most dangerous tradition. For the past 400 years, people have gathered in Ottery St. Mary to run through the streets carrying flaming barrels on their backs. So I traced this burning tradition back to its roots and found out why it refuses to die out. And the answer is simple, but it hurts. When you imagine a typical English village, you might think of quaint cottages, rolling hills, and endless cups of tea. So what could have possibly inspired such a crazy tradition? Well, imagine a group of villagers who want to stick it to the man. You've got your taxes, you've got your corrupt officials, and maybe a couple of rebellious monks thrown into the mix. This is the story of Guy Fawkes Night, a celebration of King James I's escape from a failed assassination. Attempt on November 5, 1605, also known as the Gunpowder Treason and Plot. A group of provincial English Catholics attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament by storing gunpowder in the cellars underneath. However, an anonymous letter warned a member of Parliament of the plot, leading to the discovery of the treasonous plot and the execution of the conspirators. To commemorate the day, English citizens are encouraged to celebrate with bonfires, fireworks, and yes, even flaming barrels. In Ottery St. Mary, about 200 miles southwest of London, residents were particularly enthusiastic about honoring the day. But how exactly did they do it? Let's start at the beginning. Before portable oil heaters and fireplaces, cooking was done over an open fire. And where there's fire, there's bound to be smoke. So naturally, homes needed chimneys to vent all that excess smoke. But installing a chimney costs money, and poor rural dwellers had other priorities. Instead, they cooked over tar barrels. After all, tar is highly flammable, so it made sense to make use of it. Eventually, villagers would roll the barrels through the streets, lighting them on fire. As the smoke cleared, cheers would ring out. Not because they loved the smoke, but because it meant that the effigy representing King James I had been smoked out and chased away. But if you thought these early celebrations were tame, wait until you see what came next. So while smoking out the king was all fun and games, things really heated up when people started participating. We don't know exactly when or why this shift occurred, but we do know that it happened soon after the original tar barrel rolling festivals. By the 17th century, residents started racing through the streets, carrying the blazing barrels on their backs. And no, they didn't do it for the sizzle. It was symbolic. They wanted to prove that they weren't afraid of anything, not even the king. These brave souls literally took the heat so that future generations could breathe easy. And for a while, the festival stayed small scale, mostly because the idea of covering yourself in flames was pretty terrifying. That is, until one man stepped forward. Legend says that a guy named Jack Pudding was looking for some excitement in his life. So in 1848, he decided to take part in the annual event. But he wanted to do it bigger and better than anyone else. He carried 16 barrels on his back at once, setting a record that stood for over 100 years. Today, participants aren't expected to carry nearly as much. Each runner must carry at least one barrel. But if they want to participate in the competition, they have to carry 3. That means that every November, the streets of Old Town become a giant obstacle course full of fire, smoke, and sore feet. Throughout the decades, the Tar Barrels Festival has grown in popularity. Spectators come from all over the country to watch men and women brave the scorching heat. Each year, the event draws in more than 40,000 spectators, and no wonder. Imagine watching someone complete an entire lap without dropping a single barrel. Even better, the runners can reach speeds of up to 30 miles per hour. Just to give you an idea of how hot these races get, just ask Bob Champion. Back in 1983, he set the world record for carrying the most flaming barrels, an incredible 20. Sadly, he dropped one, putting his fellow runners at risk. Ever since then, records have been put on hold due to safety concerns. Still, you might be wondering, why do they still do it? Why do people willingly cover themselves in flames and smoke? It's actually a bit simpler than you'd think. People do it to keep the tradition alive. When something has been celebrated for centuries, it can be hard to change, especially when everyone benefits from keeping things the same. Sure, it's painful, hot, and dangerous, but isn't that the point? Pain is exciting, especially when you can share it with thousands of people. Think about it. Did you participate in a centuries-old tradition that involved running through the streets while carrying flaming barrels on your back? Probably not. But if your friends and family did it every year, it would be hard not to feel left out. Over time, it becomes a community effort, a way of bonding with neighbors and creating memories. But that doesn't explain why they started in the first place. Well, besides wanting to stick it to the king, there was another reason: showing off. Every year, 2 teams compete for the title of Tar Baron. Members of the Uppitary Upsetters go head-to-head against the Tiggles, trying to outdo each other. It's a friendly competition, but the stakes are high. The winning team gets to parade through the streets with the coveted silver Tuggle Cup. To qualify, each team needs at least one runner who can successfully complete a lap around the 1.5-mile course. But that's not all. Each runner has to pass a flaming hoop on the ground and collect a coin from a woman in a Victorian nightgown. You might be wondering how the judges determine a winner when everyone completes the course. That's a great question, but we'll save the answer for later. For now, let's talk about some of the rules, because this isn't a free-for-all. Every participant must wear gloves and protective clothing. In addition, the barrels are filled with a special blend of tar and paraffin. It burns at about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's almost as hot as the surface of the sun. Each barrel weighs between 2 and 4 gallons and stands just under 2 feet tall. When full, they weigh over 30 pounds. You'll need more than muscle to win this race. You'll need some serious endurance. So how long can someone safely run with a flaming barrel on their back? According to tar barrel legend, 10 minutes is the magic number. If a runner can complete a full lap in that amount of time, they're good to go. It's an unwritten rule, but trust me, no one wants to break it. If they do, they'll be greeted with angry boos from the crowd. That's right.
Oh!
Audience members aren't allowed to cheer unless the runner completes a lap within 10 minutes. Otherwise, they'll have to sit tight until someone else steps up to the plate. But sometimes, the best-laid plans go up in smoke. Throughout the decades, the festival hasn't been without its mishaps. In 1910, someone dropped a barrel, starting a fire that destroyed 5 houses. In 1962, a teenager suffered second-degree burns on his legs and arms. That same year, an adult suffered a broken ankle. Authorities tried to ban the festival, But the townspeople argued back, saying that they had the right to continue the centuries-old tradition. In 1968, Ottery St. Mary's mayor backed the ban, citing safety issues and potential damage to property. But the people voted it down. Despite all the accidents and injuries, they didn't want the fun to end. Today, the Tar Barrels Festival is considered one of the most extreme local sports in Europe. And although it hasn't seen much action in recent years, that doesn't mean it's gone for good. In fact, it's making a comeback. Last year, organizers estimated that over 40,000 people showed up to watch the event. So you'll probably want to plan ahead if you want to attend. Now for the big question, which team takes home the title of Tar Baron? Well, the answer is simple. It depends on who shows up. The Apettery Upsetters usually wins because more members show up to run. But if both teams are equally matched, then it all comes down to who reaches the finish line first. Oh, and remember those coins I mentioned earlier? They're not just for show. If a runner drops one, they get an extra second added to their time. So although winning seems straightforward, it also requires a lot of strategy. The Tar Barrels Festival is an important part of English culture, and it wouldn't be where it is today without all the people who participated throughout the decades. Whether they won or lost, each runner played a role in preserving history. So if you ever find yourself in Ottery St. Mary in November, don't be surprised if you hear screams in the night followed by applause. Thanks for watching. Which team would you cheer for and why? Tell us in the comments below. They invented a sport where you win by kicking someone until they fall. So I looked into how this pain fest started, and why it still has fans 400 years later. You won't believe what I found. Let me show you how shin kicking became the weirdest sport Britain refuses to give up. And yes, in the next Cotswold Olympics you can sign up to get kicked too. It's me. Welcome to my channel. Every August bank holiday weekend, which is a lot like Labor Day here in the States, the village of Westonbirt in Gloucestershire hosts an event known as the Cotswold Olympics. The festival celebrates everything we love about rural England. Maurice dancing, sheepdog trials, tug-of-war, plus traditional sports such as shin kicking. But before we get to that, let me paint the picture for those of you who haven't seen this spectacle. On a sunny afternoon, men from across England gather in pairs to battle it out for glory. But there's a catch. Each man must stuff hay into his shorts. Why? Well, I'll tell you all about that shortly. They stand toe-to-toe and throw in a few playful punches while the crowd cheers them on. Then suddenly one of them kicks out, connecting squarely with the other's shin. The crowd gasps. The recipient of the kick grimaces, but stands his ground. The pain is clear on his face. Looks like he might collapse. In fact, that's the goal. It continues until one of them falls over. And if you think these kicks are light taps, well, think again. These kicks connect with the force of a full tackle in American football. Trust me, you don't want to be on the receiving end. That begs the question, why would anyone participate? Let's find out. Back in 1612, King James I granted the royal charter to the man considered to be the founder of the Cotswold Games, a local sheep shearer named Edward Custis. Legend has it that Edward was inspired after watching a group of shepherds compete in athletic games. He wanted to expand on the idea, so organized his own competition, inviting villagers from around the region to take part. The first Olympiad took place near Cirencester, featuring events such as wrestling, foot and horse racing, archery, running, and long-distance walking. But Edward had a particular soft spot for wrestling. In fact, he even wrote a book called The Noble Science of Wrestling, which he dedicated to King James himself. But this royal recognition wasn't to last. The Olympics were effectively shut down during the English Civil War between the parliamentarians and the royalists. Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the parliamentarians, considered the games to be frivolous and a distraction from more important matters. In fact, he once interrupted a match by riding his horse right through the middle of the course. He'd fined the contestants and told them to go home, but the spirit of the games lived on. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, people continued to hold unofficial competitions, passing the traditions down to new generations. Fast forward to 1965, when the Cotswold Olympics were officially revived. Today, thousands of visitors flock to Westonbirt each year to watch the unique competitions, including the highlight, shin kicking. So now that we know it was around since the early 17th century, let's talk about why these men stuff hay into their pants. Some historians suggest that the hay served a practical purpose. Back then, the trousers of the day were made of wool, which could snag and tear easily. By stuffing hay into their pants, the men cushioned themselves against painful kicks. It's a bit like wearing armor. Others speculate that the hay added weight to the shorts, making it easier to trip up one's opponent. But perhaps the most intriguing theory is that it was simply a way to distract the opponent. After all, getting hit in the leg with a sharp stick isn't exactly fun. And if your enemy is preoccupied with swatting away hay, well, that's one less thing for him to worry about. Plus, it adds to the comedic value of the event. Just imagine the look on your opponent's face when he gets a mouthful of hay. But wait, there's more. For the ultimate level of protection, some athletes even wear old leather football boots on their legs. These boots add an extra layer of defense and help absorb the impact of those powerful kicks. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't this whole shin-kicking thing just a bunch of barbaric fun? Well, not exactly. There have been serious injuries. In 2011, one competitor broke his fibula, which is the lower of the two bones in your shin. That's not a fun injury. The rules have been designed to ensure the safety of the participants, at least somewhat. Matches are only fought to a knockout, meaning the game ends when one player knocks the other out. Referees monitor the action closely, stopping the match if things get too rough. Medical professionals are also on standby to provide first aid to any injured players. But despite these precautions, shin kicking remains a dangerous sport. Players need to be in peak physical condition to participate, and even then there's always a risk of injury. Perhaps that's part of the thrill for some. I mean, imagine being able to call yourself a shin-kicking champion. It's something else. The matches aren't all rough and tumble, though. There's actually a bit of strategy involved. Experienced fighters will often keep their dominant leg behind them, hoping to catch their opponent off guard with a quick kick. Others prefer to keep their distance, dancing around the ring and looking for an opening. When they see one, they strike. But the element of surprise only goes so far. A good shin kicker needs to be quick, agile, and have excellent timing. The best fighters train for months, sometimes years, perfecting their technique and building up their endurance. In the end, though, shin kicking comes down to one thing: pain tolerance. Some people have higher pain thresholds than others. That's why the sport attracts a certain type of person. It's not for the faint of heart. It takes a special kind of tough guy to step into the ring and face off against another human being. And if that sounds like you, then maybe it's time to lace up your boots and give shin kicking a try. Just remember, protect those shins. Here's an interesting bit of trivia. Did you know that the ancient Thebes once assembled an elite military force consisting of 150 pairs of gay male lovers? These lovers went undefeated in war. But that's not all. Their prowess extended beyond the battlefield. They became champions at the ancient Olympics, winning 3 consecutive victories. You're probably wondering, who were these legendary warriors and what made them so formidable? Does it have anything to do with the fact that they were gay male lovers? Curious, right? Well, if you are, click the card or link in the description below to continue learning about this fascinating topic. This is a glamorous rooftop bar in 1950s, Las Vegas. Well-dressed men and women sip drinks as they gaze across the desert at a distant mushroom cloud rising above the Nevada test site. Cheers and laughter echo over the soft strains of a piano. It's a perfect summer evening. And just beyond the shimmering lights of the strip, something terrible has just happened. A nuclear bomb has just exploded, and these partygoers are here for the show. 10 minutes later, I'll tell you about the time people vacation to watch nuclear bombs explode. Here's what happened when nuclear weapons met hotel marketing. Atomic testing was supposed to be a top-secret military operation, but it was impossible to keep the public in the dark forever. Word got out that the US government was setting off explosives in the Nevada desert, and people wanted to see it for themselves. But how could a small-town army base in the middle of nowhere become an overnight sensation? That's where Vegas came in. With a little creativity, they turned the Cold War into a gold mine. In the early 1950s, the US government was determined to develop the most powerful weapon ever seen. The plan was simple: set off a series of nuclear bombs in the Nevada desert and collect data on their destructive power. The only problem was nobody knew how dangerous these weapons really were, but that wouldn't stop people from finding out. It started with soldiers stationed nearby catching wind of the mysterious tests. Rumor had it that the government was detonating bombs and collecting intel on what happens when cities get nuked. But it wasn't long before civilians caught on too. People around the country heard about the tests and started heading out to the Nevada desert in droves. They might not have known exactly what they were looking for, but they knew they didn't want to miss whatever it was. By 1953, word had spread to Las Vegas, and seeing an opportunity to drum up business, the city's hotels began advertising blast viewing parties. For a few dollars, tourists could grab a cocktail and find the best spot to watch the mushroom cloud rise above the horizon. It was the perfect addition to any bachelor party. At first, the government tried to keep the tests under wraps, but it was no use. More and more people showed up, and it became clear that there was no stopping them. So officials relented and decided to make the best of it. For the next several years, Las Vegas hosted official Atomic Testing Week celebrations, complete with fireworks, parades, and of course, plenty of cocktails. At the Golden Nugget Hotel, guests could order the official atomic cocktail, a concoction of cherry lemonade and black cherry liqueur served with a souvenir glass that read, "Here today, gone tomorrow." Meanwhile, at the Las Vegas club, bartenders mixed up blast and fallout martinis. There was even a special brunch called the Blast Viewing Breakfast, where hungry customers could take in the view while enjoying some eggs and bacon. On May 1st, 1953, everything changed. Officials set off the first hydrogen bomb, and the blast was unlike anything anyone had seen before. The fireball alone was 3 miles wide. The mushroom cloud rose 40 miles high, and the explosion could be seen from Los Angeles. It was the most powerful weapon ever detonated, and it changed the future of warfare forever. But it also changed the future of Vegas. Overnight, the desert town became the center of America's fascination with atomic power. Hotels were packed and restaurants were busy. Everyone wanted to get a glimpse of the mushroom cloud. To make sure they didn't miss a thing, Vegas installed giant viewing screens so people could watch the tests from the comfort of their hotel rooms. They even put telephoto cameras on the roofs of buildings so people could watch from their balconies. But not everyone was content to watch from afar. Some people wanted to get up close and personal with the blast, and they weren't alone. Scientists were eager to learn more about the effects of nuclear radiation, so they hit the books and came up with a plan. If they could measure the amount of radiation released by the blast, then they could figure out how safe it was to be around one. So they recruited some volunteers, gave them Geiger counters, and sent them off into the desert. What could possibly go wrong? First, nothing. The scientists found that the amount of radiation was relatively low, so they gave the all clear and invited more people to come and watch. But they soon realized that they had made a mistake. The radiation levels were higher than they thought, and several people began to get sick. The government quickly covered up the incident, but it did little to stop the rumors from spreading. People started talking about the dangers of nuclear radiation, and no one wanted to risk being exposed to it. But that didn't stop some people who were willing to bet it all on the ultimate thrill. As the mushroom cloud rose above the horizon, they headed out into the desert to get as close as possible. They sipped cocktails and took photos, all the while bathing in the glow of the nuclear blast. They were the atomic tourists, and they were obsessed. One of the most popular spots was the town of Rachel, Nevada. Located just 10 miles away from the test site, Rachel was the closest town to the action. And during Atomic Testing Week, it was hopping. Onlookers would flock to the town's Alien Research Center, a gift shop and restaurant run by a man named Bob Gimlin. He claimed that aliens had landed in the area, and locals believed him. Soon the parking lot was filled with cars, and the Alien Research Center was serving up burgers and fries to eager customers. There was just one problem. The place was a fake. Gimlin had made the whole thing up to attract tourists, but it worked like a charm. As the years passed, more and more people showed up to see the so-called aliens. And Gimlin wasn't the only one cashing in. Businesses all over Rachel boomed. Motels, gas stations, and restaurants were packed, and everyone was making money. That was until the radiation started to show its effects. At first, it wasn't anything serious. A few people got sick, but they recovered quickly, and no one thought much of it. But as the years passed, things got worse. More people started getting sick, and some of them didn't make it. It soon became clear that the radiation was having a devastating effect on the town, and something had to be done. The government quickly stepped in and evacuated Rachel. They offered the residents money to move and promised to clean up the town, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The once thriving town was now a ghost town, and no one wanted to go near it. As the decades passed, the the story of Rachel faded from memory. But the atomic tourists never forgot their trip to the desert. They returned again and again, eager to see another blast. The government kept setting off bombs. But in the 1990s, something changed. The Cold War was coming to an end, and the government was winding down the nuclear tests. By 1992, the last underground nuclear explosion had been detonated. The atomic tourists were devastated, but they had one last chance to see a blast. In 1994, the government set off the final nuclear weapon in the Nevada desert. It was an above-ground test, and the explosion could be seen for miles. The atomic tourists gathered in Vegas and watched as the mushroom cloud rose above the horizon. It was their last chance to experience the thrill of the blast, and they weren't going to miss it. As the years passed, the memories of Atomic Testing Week faded from memory. But the atomic tourists knew they had something special. They had witnessed the power of the atom firsthand, and they knew that no one else could understand what that was like. In the end, it didn't matter that the tests were over. The glowing memories, those stayed. Here's a rule. If your hobby has made it to the internet, it's not unique or special anymore. Everything from knitting to collecting space shuttles to enjoying coffee out of a giant teacup has been on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. So if you want to feel like an original weirdo, you have to look back. And boy, do I have two weirdos for you today. In the 1800s, people went nuts over headless photos. It was the era's equivalent of posting selfies without your head. And last I checked, that was still going strong. But here's the kicker. People paid good money to get them done. Which raises questions like, would you pay to have your head chopped off a picture? And what does it say about me that I immediately said yes? Well, I guess we're going to find out to understand what these pictures were all about. If you talk about the technology at the time. Because remember, this was before Photoshop and things were a little bit different then. Like there weren't even cameras, so photos had to be taken using a process called wet collodion. To make a negative, you coat a glass plate in chemicals. Put the plate inside a big black box. Let light hit it, take the plate out, develop it, and voila image. The reason it sounds so complicated is because it kind of is, which is why it was practiced by chemists and wizards alike. The most popular type of image produced was a whole-body portrait, but it had a problem. After you take the photo, you've got to develop the plate while you're holding it. Getting the thing level is really hard, and it often came out crooked, tilting the subject with it. Now don't get me wrong, the results could be breathtaking, but usually they just looked like this, and it was annoying. So people started experimenting with leaning the camera sideways, which would make the horizon straight, but leave the subject lopsided. Then someone realized they could just remove the top part of the picture later, and voila, no more wonky heads. Conveniently, this also made everyone look slightly deranged. But here's the important bit. Early photographers loved showing off how they'd manipulated reality. They sent their images all over the world to be displayed at conventions where they'd take-home prizes for manipulating reality. The goal was to trick viewers into thinking they were looking at a real live person, when, in fact, they were staring at a sinister shadow person doing the Macarena on a glass plate. All in all, it was the OG special effect. And you know what that means? A time for the worst special effect ever. At first, the public thought headless photos were super wacky and fun. They showed up everywhere from newspapers to Christmas cards. Then people started asking, well, if I don't have a head, do I have a neck? Leading to the realization that the hobby was kind of running out of steam. Still, some enthusiasts saw dollar signs and offered a new product: fake decapitations. These posed photos were meant to look like gruesome murder scenes, complete with blood and severed limbs. Naturally, people lost interest after a while. Maybe not surprisingly, these days you can order similar photos online, but it's mostly a gag gift for friends who need to learn how to chill. Now as for me, I'm still waiting on my physical copy of Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance to arrive. In case you couldn't tell, these photos were a massive meme, but they only scratched the surface of human weirdness. That's because our second story goes even deeper into the rabbit hole of oddities. It's the tale of gurning, aka competitive face contorting. And unlike headless photos, it's still happening today. Every year in September, the seaside town of Egremont, UK hosts the World Gurning Championships. Hundreds of contestants from all over the UK travel there hoping to bring home the coveted title of World Gurning Champion. Believe me when I say it's fierce competition. Take Eddie Sudi Walmsley, the winner in 2019 and 2021. His signature move is sticking. his tongue out as far as he can and holding poses for up to a minute. Or take Sam Crabtree, the 2018 and 2020 champion, whose contorted faces have made him a local celebrity in Cumbria. The current record holder is Tommy the Bristler Whittaker, who won the competition 4 years in a row between 2013 and 2016. He is considered so talented that organizers actually had to invent a harder category just so he would win every year. All of which brings us back to the question, how did we get here? Turns out there are two theories, neither of which involves talking cats. The first is that gurning started in the 1700s as a way for sailors to scare off evil spirits. That's right. Sailors would pull their faces into terrifying shapes to protect themselves against demons. And while this seems plausible, historians have never found any evidence to support it. More likely is that gurning developed independently in many cultures around the same time. As proof, you need only look to China, where grotesque masks have been worn in festivals since the Shang dynasty, over 3,000 years ago. But regardless of how it started, by the 1800s, gurning was deeply embedded in British culture. It was seen as a test of willpower and endurance, like keeping a hand in the air during class or playing chicken with a train. In other words, it was a game for children. But that all changed when a group of adults entered the fray. For decades, competitions were held regularly at Cumberland and Westmoreland county fairs, but the event struggled to stay afloat until 1961, when a man named Tom Ginger took over as organizer. Under his leadership, the festival grew exponentially. Attendance numbers went from a few hundred to several thousand people. And while some credit Ginger with turning the fair into the cultural juggernaut it is today, others think he was just lucky because, and I cannot stress this enough, it's a face-pulling contest. How hot was 1961? Oh. Still, no one denies that gurning has endured for over half a century because, let's face it, it's freaking hilarious. I mean, just check out this footage. Look at these faces. New humans could do that. But here's the important bit. If you want to participate, you don't need to travel to Agreement. There are plenty of opportunities closer to home. Every year, towns across the UK host their own mini gurning festivals. Last year, Newcastle even held its own citywide contest, though admittedly, the prize was only a bottle of Newcastle Brown Ale. It's not exactly the World Gurning Championships, but hey, who knows? Maybe you're the next Tommy the Bristler Whittaker. Sure hope so. For the sake of content, if nothing else, I just love the idea of thousands of grown men standing around screaming ogre mount at each other. Now, in case you're wondering, there is a US equivalent, although it's less about pulling faces and more about laughing really hard. It's called the World's Funniest Person Contest, held annually in the town of North Tonawanda, New York. Still, I'd argue that no matter where you go, nothing beats the originals. The combination of wholesome crowds, uproarious energy, and genuinely disgusting expressions makes for a fascinating spectacle. And if you're ever in the area next September, be sure to keep an eye out for a strange sight. Hordes of smiling weirdos sprinting down a street while clutching trophies and wearing sashes that say World Gurning Champion. I don't know about you, but I can't wait for next year's competition. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a thumbs up. I appreciate when you do that. It helps the channel tremendously. Also, you should check out the description for more information on the weird world of headless photos and gurning. Anyway, thanks for spending time with us. We'll see you next week.